All right. Well, I know we've got a couple people on the road, and that's uh, quite okay. Don't worry about that at all. Um, so, welcome to everyone here. My name is Thomas Arnold. I'm hard to believe, but a internet intellect salon host for 5 years when things went online during lockdown. And welcome to all of you. If this is your first salon, welcome. And please, we want anyone who's not an Intellect member to at least check out interintellect.com and see what we're about and what kind of salons we put on. So today, really excited to have Reverend Matthew Ichihashi Potts talk about his book Forgiveness. And Matt is the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals at Harvard Divinity School and the Pusey Minister at Memorial Church, which is arguably, I guess, the hub of spiritual care at Harvard University. So wears both those kind of academic and pastoral, I don't think pastors wear hats, but plays both of those roles. And so it's really a pleasure to talk about your book that has both of those elements of both academic depth, thinking about philosophically what forgiveness is and is not, but then also thinking concretely and historically about what counts as forgiveness and what are the historical barriers and impediments to something that we might think of as counting as forgiveness. So, welcome to you, Matt. Thank you so much for being here. Why don't I let you give us a little bit of background in terms of I believe the history of this is a project that goes back a while, but what brought you to forgiveness in particular is something theological, and your particular way of going at theology via literature and examples of literature. You know, what motivates that? What do you draw from that? And then we can get a little bit more into your actual view of forgiveness. But welcome, and go ahead and start us off.
Okay, thanks, Thomas, and thanks to Interintellect for having me, hosting me. Um, yeah, those are the answers to both those questions are pretty lengthy. I'll try to, or they can be, you know. I'll try to not speak uh, for too long about either of them while still kind of giving a sense. That it's interesting you said, I have this dual role at Harvard. When I was writing the book, I didn't have a dual role at Harvard. I was a professor only, but I was working part-time as a minister at a church not at Harvard, right? So personally, I still held that kind of dual role as an academic and a priest or a pastor. Um, and I guess the shortest answer to your question about where the book comes from, it comes from that intersection, which is that just as a person, I'd always found forgiveness or kind of peaceful non-retaliation to be very moving. I remember as a child, like finding Jesus's statement from the cross while he's being crucified, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Like I found that really moving. I remember, like as a teenager, learning about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and learning about Gandhi and finding and them really powerful. Desmond Tutu when I was in college. Um, all these were very moving. I found them effectively stirring. You know what I mean? I responded to them in a way that made it feel challenging and fascinating and difficult but also good and true, right? Um, and so I got interested in forgiveness and I started thinking about forgiveness. And in the 90s and early aughts, there was, especially in sort of continental philosophy, there was some deliberation about the nature of forgiveness. And for reasons I didn't necessarily understand at the time that I was starting to read those things, but I was just getting interested. I was, beginning my graduate studies then and getting interested in some of these schools of thought. Um, and I didn't write on forgiveness for my dissertation research. I did religion and literature to kind of speak in advance as an answer to your other question. But I taught a class on forgiveness pretty early in my time here at
Mm.
Harvard. Um, and in the first, I've taught that class several times since, but the first version of that class was very different from the versions that I ended up teaching later. And one of the reasons it was different is because in that class, I had a student come to me during office hours with like a question that I couldn't answer, and I thought I needed to answer. This student was Harvard Divinity School is a school that trains both academics and pastors. This student was training to become a minister uh, as a second career. She had a first career as a therapist. She was a licensed social worker, and she had a private therapy practice. And she came to my office hours because she was in my forgiveness class, and she said, um, I have a question for you that has to do with one of my clients. And she said, one of my therapy clients. She said, well, I have a client who's recently divorced. She was married for 30 years. She is a minister, Christian minister. Her ex-spouse, her ex-husband, is also a Christian minister. Just divorced, and she suffered abuse at his hands, basically the whole span of the marriage. Um, and she has recently gotten free of him, and she is glad to be free of him. She does not wish him any harm, but her children, her church, herself, and to her belief, her God were all telling her that I have to forgive him. That especially I think from him, this is where it was the most disturbing to me, from her ex-husband, there's this pressure. God has that told you to forgive, you have to forgive me. Come on, you're a Christian. Let's go. Let's forgive, right? And she said, I'm a therapist. I know what to tell her as a therapist. She said, but I'm going to be a minister. And I'm going to have someone coming to me and asking me this question as a minister. Is this what Jesus wants her to do? That's what she said to me. I remember her asking me that way. And I just said, I can't believe it is. I can't believe that's what Jesus wants her to do. And I realized that my conception of forgiveness was insufficient. Right? Because like I had this very romantic and maybe sentimental idea of forgiveness that was built by people who were neither romantic nor sentimental, Desmond Tutu, Martin Luther King, and Jesus, right? But I had developed this very romantic and sentimental version of forgiveness, and I thought it was this beautiful, challenging thing that applied across the board. And then I had a real case, a concrete case of a person saying, this can't work. What am I supposed to do? And I thought I should start thinking about this in a more serious way and start thinking about the reasons why this forgiveness maybe doesn't work. And then almost immediately after that, there was, the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, which had a different relationship to what they were calling forgiveness in most cases than what the civil rights movement maybe did, or at least they talked about it differently or thought about it differently, or Christianity informed the movements differently. And I felt like I needed to take those critiques seriously as well. So that's where like sort of germ for like why might I want to rethink forgiveness? Is it a thing worth saving? And if it is, what is the version that we can construct? Why religion and literature is that's a great question. Uh, there's a very direct answer, which is I'll confess is maybe not super interesting, but it's honest, which is I prefer reading literature to theology. A lot of
Very
theology
understandable. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of theology is pretty boring. That doesn't mean it's not good, and I include myself among the boring in that category, maybe. Um, and good fiction is engaging and pulls you in. But there's another reason, which is that one of the problems I see with the way forgiveness has traditionally been conceived, or recently been conceived by the Christian tradition, is that there's the illusion that it tidies things, that it wraps things up and makes things complete or closes a problem, closes a moral conflict in a very tidy, neat way. And it's the end of a thing which is final. Um, uh, and the forgiveness that I argue for in the book is one which is the opposite. It's one which understands that in the wake of harm and conflict, nothing is tidy. And what we need to do is learn how to navigate the mess. Um, and this is there are exceptions, but generally, a discourse like theology is trying to be precise and describe things and package everything up for you and say, it's over. Here it is. I've given it to you. I've explained it all. Whereas the spirit of a genre like literature or fiction is to actually give you the mess and leave you with questions. I mean, everyone here who's read a good poem or a good piece of a short story or a good novel knows that what makes it good is that you're up night thinking about it, right? Because you don't really know what you think afterwards. And it started to occur to me that maybe a genre like literature can help us get at the messiness of forgiveness better than maybe a genre like theology. Um, and also, it was if I'm going to spend 4 or 5 years writing a book, I'd like to sit with books that I that I like reading. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. And I think the way you start the book is with the powerful, harrowing incident in Charleston in 2015 of Dylan Roof um, killing 9 members of the Emmanuel AME Church, and the different reactions of family members of those killed. Uh, Gives, on the one hand, you'd said around the distinction between therapy and ministerial guidance. That incident, by opening it, you kind of open up the political
yeah,
commentating of what Ta-Nehisi Coates saying, is this real? Could people actually forgive this guy for what he did and still respect and register the horror of what happened? So I think that was a very, that was an arresting and non-literary in the sense of diving right into novels. We have this really fresh, relatively speaking, incident of why this is such a problem and
yeah.
what are we going to do about it. So I think that makes um, it it throws us in without uh, it sets an interesting intro into those novels and what's happening there. Uh, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add about that, or
Yeah. I mean, I can. I think that's another situation, right? Where I when it happened, this is, I wanted to think about why is why is the idea of forgiveness that we have, why does it seem insufficient at this moment? A. And B, those families who were forgiving, and not all of them were, it's important to name that, but those families were forgiving. Are they talking about the same thing that others are talking about when we see them forgiving, right? Because so I talk about this scene from I was reading an interview of Ta-Nehisi Coates right after this event, and the interviewer said they were in this sports bar or something, and they had the news behind her as she was interviewing him, and he could see the arraignment of Dylan Roof, the murderer, on TV, and he saw some of the families forgiving, and he said, "Is that real? I question the realness of that." And and I want to know, like, why would one question the realness of that? And I get why one would, because, like, how could you not be angry at Dylan Roof? How could you be ready to reconcile with Dylan Roof? How could you, like, accommodate or say it's okay, whatever, like, to Dylan Roof when your loved one was murdered like a day ago? It does seem impossible, right? Um, it- until you look at the exact, the words of the family members when they said, "I forgive." Right? So one of the surviving family members said, "I acknowledge that I am angry, but I forgive you." Right? Another one said, this was afterwards. This wasn't at the arraignment, but in an interview afterwards, another family member, a surviving family member said, I want nothing to do with Dylan Roof. He's not part of our lives. He will never be part of our lives. In fact, if the state wants to execute him, that's on the state. For me, what I did is I forgave him and we are moving on. I don't want to ever think about him again. Right? Like that they were saying I forgive in a way that I think the larger media discourse, what they wanted to hear in these families' forgiveness was the kind of romantic, sentimental forgiveness that I had wanted to hear. But if you listen closely to what they're saying, they're not saying that. In fact, one of the surviving families said, don't don't assume by our forgiveness that we are not angry or that we are not demanding change, right? Like the fact that we are forgiving does not mean that we don't also say this has to stop and we are still angry and we deserve justice. That how can we hold both things together at the same time? Um, I think a lot of the media reaction to that act of forgiveness, and another very public and famous act of forgiveness is the same. A lot of the media reaction around whether it was good or wrong to offer forgiveness is presuming a kind of forgiveness which is the romantic and sentimental kind that I had also been presuming, but the one that's actually being offered and extended is more I mean because it must be because these are survivors is it's much more it's angry and it's seeking justice and it's all the things that that a more sentimental version maybe isn't.
Right. Well, that um, is a good lead in for uh, the different aspects of forgiveness that you kind of help tease apart, given that there's such thick associations with uh, what is implied by those sentimental romantic views in terms of how are you going to relate to the person that
Yeah.
you forgive, and implicit in your first example of the student who is has escaped an abusive marriage. It's quite concrete as to what does that mean? Does that mean they have to celebrate holidays together? And often that is urged upon, as you point out, it's urged upon victims as, come on, forgive, forget, come back. So could you talk a little bit about reconciliation? Because it seems like among the theme there are a few different themes that we can get to, but that might be one of the more powerful ones that we first associate with.
Yeah.
Once you've forgiven, then there shouldn't be necessarily a problem with you being in that space. So that church member who said, "I don't want anything to do with Dylan Roof for the rest of my life," like you said, it kind of jars. Uh, but your argument is that doesn't rule out forgiveness at all. So could you talk a little bit about reconciliation? Why
Yeah.
that distinction?
Yeah. Um, yeah, there are a few things. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the other ones. There are few things that kind of collapse into forgiveness in our colloquial use of the language of forgiveness. That when we say to someone, "I forgive you," or when we hear someone say to us, "I forgive you," we're hearing a bunch of things, right? That maybe we should or shouldn't be hearing, right? But at least one of the things that we often think we hear is, "I forgive you. Let's reconcile. Let's restore a relationship." Or when we say, "Will you forgive me?" What we're actually asking is, "Can we go back to the way things were? Can we restore a relationship?" Um, and yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I'm a Christian pastor, as you said, one of the challenges for Christians is in the philosophical discourse around this, there are two kinds of forgiveness. There's conditional and unconditional forgiveness. Conditional forgiveness means I'll forgive you when you've met some conditions, right? Unconditional forgiveness, which one could read the Gospels to be exhorting Christians to follow, means I forgive you regardless of, you don't have to meet any conditions. You have my forgiveness always already, just by virtue of the fact that you are a person and I'm a person. That's the way it reads. Um, and yeah, and so this is part of the thing with like collapsing reconciliation into unconditional forgiveness, right? Because if forgiveness is the same thing as reconciliation, and my forgiveness is unconditional, I get really scared about making our reconciliation unconditional, right? At the very least, a survivor of harm should be guaranteed safe before there's any kind of restored relationship. And probably more. There probably needs to be some sort of recompense or repair before a relationship should be restored, right? Um, it seems to me that reconciliation has to be conditional. Otherwise, it becomes reckless or too open to kind of repeated harm, repeated abuse, right? And so, if we want to, one of the reasons why I want to separate reconciliation from forgiveness is because it seems that they're separable, right? And you look at examples like the Charleston shooting, where people who say they are offering forgiveness are not seeking reconciliation, right? Um, and it also seems really important because if we allow them to stay collapse into one another, then the Christian pressure towards unconditional forgiveness will invariably lead to people reconciling, feeling that being pressured into reconciling when they ought not to reconcile. Um, and this there's a tradition of this. I mean, as I said, Desmond Tutu was one of my kind of spiritual and political heroes. Um, and he was a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. And, they had strengths and they had weaknesses, which are widely debated and discussed in a lot of the academic conversation and political conversation around the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They did, in general, avoid larger scale civil war and violence. Um, And they were about reconciliation. They were about trying to, excuse me, so they were about trying to restore relationships in the country. But Tutu, when he talked about him publicly, he talked about forgiveness, and he wrote a book about forgiveness. I think he's a savvy politician. I think he knew the emotional power of the language of forgiveness, and that's why he used it. But I also think there is some danger, as I've described, in equating forgiveness with reconciliation for just the reasons I described. It seems dangerous to survivors to make forgiveness the same thing as reconciliation.
Yeah, that is interesting about the rhetorical use of forgiveness and uh, kind of bringing that in because of how powerful it is. I mean, another, I think, really distinctive part of your account and set of reflections is on emotion, and you're probably the only book I've read that has the Bishop Joseph Butler and Judith Butler in equal measure uh, in terms of radical theorists and traditional sermon.
Yep.
But it's interesting how you not only get into what is required or what doesn't need to be required in terms of emotional state, as with the family member in Charleston who said, "I'm still angry. I'm perfectly still angry, and I forgive you." Those aren't contradictory. But it's also interesting that in your readings, you pick out how people, for instance, this Bishop Joseph Butler in the 18th century, that people are reading things in that he's not even saying about resentment. That he's kind of pegged as this needing to be an emotional and affective transformation, where he even says, "No, resentment is totally understandable, and you know." not something that you want to repress. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Anger, resentment, where
Yeah.
those uh, can be retained with a notion of forgiveness.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the other example. Like there are a couple examples, but the two primary reconciliation and then sort of anger management, right? That often what we mean when we say to someone, I forgive you, is I'm not angry anymore. Or when we hear someone say, I forgive you, what we think we hear them saying is I'm not angry anymore. Um, and I got curious about why that is and if that's actually right. If we can be angry while forgiving. Now, Joseph Butler, who was this 18th century bishop, kind of moral philosopher, he gave these sermons, and he gave a couple of sermons, two sermons right in a row. They were on a passage from Matthew 5 where Jesus says, "Love your enemies." And the title of the first sermon from the same passage, "Love your enemies," the title of the first sermon is "Upon Resentment," and the title of the second sermon is "Upon the Forgiveness of Sins." Both take as their scripture, though, "Love your enemies." And what he says is that, and you're right, against kind of a lot of his reception among philosophers who see him as being one of the early modern thinkers who starts to associate forgiveness with emotion, he does so in order to say resentment's good. He says, he actually says resentment is something we need. We humans need resentment. Otherwise, how are we going to know when we're harmed? Or how are we going to know when people we care about are harmed? He's like, resentment is actually a natural part of what it means to be human, and we shouldn't wish it away. And he also says that like it, Jesus says, love your enemy. He says love can be angry, right? Like if you love someone, if you want to protect them, you might get angry about something that happens. He says quite clearly, like our job is not to police affect. Our job, the experience of emotion is not itself morally good or bad. It's what we do with our emotions, right? And so he says, of course you'll feel angry when someone hurts you. You can forgive someone even if you're still angry. The failure of forgiveness, he says, is when we abuse our anger, when we do something with our anger, act in a way that causes the kind of harm which he thinks is out of scale with what forgiveness should be. Now, where he ends up with what forgiveness is or isn't is slightly different from where I end up. But what I think is really interesting about him is him being insisting very early on, and one of these foundational kind of moral philosophers in the early modern period, just saying, of course we'll feel anger, right? Why wouldn't you feel anger? And importantly, for a Christian kind of theology of forgiveness, of course, love feels anger, right? That kind of affective complexity to loving action seems to me to be really important. And so we can, if love can feel anger, and Jesus is telling us to love our enemies, then forgiveness seems like it could feel anger too. The question is, what are you doing with your anger? And I think, as I read the Sermon on the Mount, as I read Matthew 5 and Joseph Butler, what Jesus is saying is that what love does with its anger is forgive, right? As opposed to retaliate or something else. And we can get, if you want, we can get into the details of that. But to me, that's really that's really important, and also I think really true to human experience. Of course we get angry with people we love, right? And of course we want to feel allowed to get angry with people we love, and of course we shouldn't use our anger to hurt people we love, right? So the question is like, what do you do with your anger? What does it signal to you? What it signals is the perpetuation of harm. And so I see, and this is what Butler said, and so I see something like the Charleston family saying, "I am angry and I forgive you." I hear them saying something like, I am not going to do violence to you or wish violence upon you the way you did to me. I am angry. I am still, because I'm still hurting. I'm still hurting because there is still injustice, right? And so that kind of forgiveness, by still feeling anger, can also demand justice. These, Black Lives Matter folks who were critical of forgiveness were critical because they thought it meant that they would, if they forgave their enemies, they would not be allowed to be angry. And anger is important because it is the kind of affective experience of decrying injustice. Um, so yeah, that's sort of the other the other big thing that we often mean when we mean forgiveness that makes it seem insipid or ineffective before real injustice and before the problems we face and the harms that we experience in the world.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think the way you set that up uh, uh, helps you see that there's the emphasis on memory, which you talk a lot about in the book, and the what kind of remembering is spiritually healthy, is socially beneficial, what type of memory is destructive and kind of leads to a downward spiral. There's the memory element about registering what has gone wrong, but then what you were just saying also points out and probably gets to some of that critique is the future orientation of, is this pattern just going to, as we see with abuse or addiction or things like that, we can focus on what has happened so far, but if we're not sufficiently real both about our feelings and things, we risk looking forward, just letting the patterns continue, which I think, as I was reading the book, I realized my conception of forgiveness is very much the memory past emphasis, and not as much preparing, as you were saying with the folks in Charleston, of going forward, we're not going to just let this type of injustice be the allowed or being complicit in things. So that seems to be part of your project too, is keeping those two together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so there are a couple other things that I think forgiveness isn't. I spent a lot of time in the book, as you know, Thomas, like talking about what forgiveness isn't, and maybe an umbrella term for so it's not anger management, it's not reconciliation. The other kind of umbrella term that could capture the other things I think it isn't is it's not a kind of erasure. It doesn't make the past go away. Um, there are lots of ways that we think about past wrongdoing and we try to move beyond it by putting it in the past, like getting rid of it, right? One of the ways we do that is we metaphorize wrongdoing as debt, right? And so you pay a debt, the debt's all gone, and we don't have to think about it anymore. The debt's gone, right? And in a case like the Charleston shootings, like there's no debt to be paid. Those people can't be brought back. You can't undo that. Debt is not a useful metaphor. And a forgiveness that depends, or a sense of wrongdoing and forgiveness operating within an economy of wrongdoing that depends upon of undoing the past or paying back the past. It's just going to fall apart. And the other kind of erasure is forgetting, right? Like forgive and forget, right? This is just move on, move on. It's all over now. It's all over now. I actually think forgiveness does something else, or ought to, which is to say, it is forward facing. I think you're right. It looks to the future, but it in the wake of harm, it acknowledges that the only foundation we can build for the future must be built upon the ground that we actually stand on, not upon like an imagined ground somewhere else, right? And that means that if we are actually going to build a stable future, a meaningful future, we have to be honest about where we are now. Or if we're going to plot a course into the future, we have to be honest about where we're starting from. And where we're starting from is here. And here may be a place which is broken and full of violence and perpetuating harm and all these things, and that kind of honesty is required. It's even in the way we think about forgiveness, right? When we say "I forgive you" to someone, um, implied in the offer of forgiveness is a condemnation, is a judgment, right? I cannot forgive a right. When I say I forgive you, I don't, I to say I forgive you presumes that there is a standing wrong that exists between us. And the forgiveness doesn't erase it. What it does is it names it. And it says, okay, well, there is a wrong between us, and we are going to try to move forward from this. And I am telling you that the only way for us to move forward from this is for us to understand that the wrong is where we're moving from, right? That
Yeah.
that this is the situation we are in, and I want to get out of it. The only way out is to start from where we are, not to pretend we're somewhere else and start from somewhere else, right? So there are lots of conceptual and practical strategies in kind of um, conflict resolution, which try to bury the past, put the past behind us. And I think forgiveness actually tries to lift it up and say, here are our wounds. This is what it means to heal from them and to move forward. Um, One of the analogies, I talked a lot about what forgiveness isn't. One of the things I say it is, kind of metaphorically, in the book is that forgiveness is almost like a kind of mourning. I think this is especially apt in cases where the harm is involves a death, right? Like my forgiveness is not going to bring back anyone who has died, at least not in this life. Um, and forgiveness is a good in the same sense that mourning is a good, not because it feels good, but it's a way of taking real stock of what we have lost and can't get back, and then trying to do the hard work of figuring out what does it mean to rebuild the life in the wake of this thing that we have lost and can't get back. Um, yeah, and so to me, that's not often, that's not often the way that forgiveness is characterized in a lot of the popular literature, at least, where it's more like a miracle or it's more like this positive, wonderful thing, and it feels good. And maybe it does feel good some days, but again, survivors of people who were killed, like in Charleston, or there's a shooting in Amish country in the aughts. A lot of those folks say it hurts every day. It's hard every day. This is not about making the past go away. It's about learning to live with the past. I should also say, I should have said this before, but I think that's also true in terms of like separating forgiveness from anger management, which is people who have been hurt deeply or who have suffered trauma, their emotions are volatile, right? I mean, if you have been traumatized, you might not be angry for 5 years, and then you'll wake up one morning and for you don't even know why, you'll be full of rage. And to say to that person all of a sudden after 5 years, oh, your forgiveness failed because you're angry today, I, I think it's not reckoning with the actual affective complexity of what it means to be a human person who's survived harm, right? And what I want is for us to develop or start or move into an idea of forgiveness that does recognize the affective complexity of what it means to survive grave harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the implication from your view is that really the people that are angry or recognize their own anger may be the real agents of forgiveness because they are the ones who can name the wrong and name the loss, name what can't be brought back,
Yeah.
uh, and that it doesn't mean that anger is the goal, but it does mean in terms of who is smoothing things over versus who is trying to get concrete and really register the depth of what happened. It's the latter who are kind of on the side of forgiveness, even though culturally the current is pushing that it's the former people. I'm thinking of kind of online apologies,
Yeah.
and just this sentimental ritual of online apologies. And one of the first, critiques is always said of they never named what they did. They just said, "I'm very sorry for the mistakes I've made," and like, okay, but what did you do? What were the mistakes? What is this is not this doesn't really help. It's um, because it allows the person in their own mind to deny what they did, but it also opens for people that don't know what they did to just kind of never confront it.
Yeah. I think also it bears saying that like we should think about the way that forgiveness is gendered and raced, right? Like it's often like in the Charleston situation, it's often people of color who are a lot of pressure is put on them to forgive, or women, a lot of pressure is put on them to forgive. And when we think about forgiveness in our culture as being as being a synonym for putting away your anger, I mean, we should start to be worried about that. We should start to be worried about like the fact that we tend to, we really pressure certain folks to forgive, and it's because we don't want to hear that they're angry, right? That's, I think that's certain folks are more allowed to be angry than others in our culture. And the fact that our common conception of forgiveness starts to dovetail with the politics of that is something that should concern moral philosophers at least, and probably and pastors certainly, right? But maybe everybody, right? And maybe what we need is actually to get more comfortable with the anger of those who have been hurt, because that means that we're listening to them and to the ways in which they've been hurt, especially when folks like the Charleston folks are saying, you know, they're not seeking retaliation. They're not seeking reciprocal harm. They're just saying I'm angry. And everyone's like, "Oh, don't be angry, don't be angry, don't be angry." Right? Like what why can't we accommodate that anger? I think it's that, maybe we get the version of forgiveness that we deserve or that we want, not the one that people are actually offering.
Yeah, I mean that to bring up one of the other threads of your account with retaliation, which I think you kind of start with. We've kind of done some of the others first, but um, what on the positive, or the um, what forgiveness is in not being retaliation. Uh, how do we understand that as something more than simply restraint, or simply checking out in a lack of action? It seems like you're struggling in the book to you know talk in as strong terms as possible of an absence of retaliation or resistance to retaliation, uh, while also needing to show in the examples of the novels that you have what that actually looks like
Yeah.
in the flesh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the positive ways that I describe what forgiveness is, if one of them is that forgiveness is a kind of mourning, the other um, kind of positive description of what forgiveness is that it's a posture of non-retaliation. Or it's what it means to seek justice without retaliation. Um, Retaliation is important, especially it's important within the Christian tradition. It's also important within like the Western conception of justice, right? The word retaliation derives from the Latin phrase, the lex talionis. Lex talionis, the word that means the law of like for like. And the law of like for like comes out a lot of places, but it comes out of the book of Exodus when eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But that that teaching in the book of Exodus is congruent with lots of teachings from the ancient Near East. And I think the oldest one we have is the Code of Hammurabi. And in Hammurabi's code, he says the same thing, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Kind of. I mean, slaves' teeth are not as important as citizens' teeth and that kind of thing, right? There were gradations of value, and that's true in Exodus to some degree as well. I mean, there's that the ear of a slave is not the same as the ear of an Israelite in Exodus, but that's where the language of retaliation comes from. It comes from like for like, which means if you harm me, I harm you in the exact same manner. And that's fair. It's a presumption that justice has something to do with fairness. And I think it bears saying that in the ancient circumstance in which these teachings were given, it's a fairly progressive and radical claim, right? If you could imagine in ancient Israel where you had powerful, very, very powerful men, the king maybe, and then poor men, they're not including women, they're not including slaves. It's not a totally progressive society, right? But the claim was that if a rich man or a powerful man knocks out the tooth of a poor or a weak man, that tooth is worth the same as the tooth of the rich man. So one for one, like for like. If the king takes out the eye of the poor soldier, the king's eye is on the dock, right? That's this idea of a fundamental equality between persons was part of the teaching, and the kind of metaphorical way the law tried to explain that was around eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now, we know from just kind of anthropological research that, or we're pretty sure that nobody actually in ancient Israelite culture that they weren't actually plucking eyes and cutting off hands. Very almost immediately, they just had a fine that stood in for the other person's eye, right? But the point was this idea of equality, right? Um, this that people are equal. Now, when Jesus in the passage that Joseph Butler was talking about, when Jesus says, "Love your enemy, bless those that curse you," and he says, when someone strikes you on the left cheek, turn to him to your right. If someone, right? Um, and he even says to them, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth." And he says, "I say to you, bless those that curse you, love your enemy," all these things, right? And then, like, quite ambitiously, maybe Jesus says immediately after saying, "You have heard the law say this. I'm going to tell you the opposite." He says, "All this I'm telling you is a fulfillment of the law. It's not undermining the law in any way. It's actually fulfilling the law." And the question is, my theological question I had in my book was, how can that be? I think my reading is that what Jesus sees as at stake in the ancient Israelite teaching, in the teaching of his people, was not the idea of harm for harm. Harm was not the logic of justice. What was at the root of justice was this idea of equality before God. That God regards the person who took out my eye just as much as God regards me. And I think Jesus might use language, or contemporary Christians might use more sentimental language, which is God loves the person who took out my eye as much as God loves me. And if that's true, then my reaction to being harmed must take into consideration the fact that God loves my enemy. And if God loves my enemy, should I be harming them? How should I be treating them? Right? And to me, that's the question forgiveness asks. This is what it means forgiveness to be to be seeking justice without retaliation. It looks at the one that harms me and says, the one that harms me is also beloved of God. And so how am I going to respond to the harm that has been done me? It can't just be a knee-jerk, exactly the same thing they did to me as I'm going to do to them. Because that's not thinking about the fact that God loves them. That's thinking about the harm that I suffered, right? Like that's making justice dependent upon this idea of harm for harm rather than, oh, the one who harmed me is also beloved of God. And now we need to do the hard work of figuring out what takes to repair. And it might be costly to that person, right? It doesn't mean that the other person will bear no cost or that, right? It just means that as I deliberate and think about how to move forward from harm, loving my enemy, or at least if I can't love my enemy, believing that God still loves my enemy, has to enter in the logic of how I respond. And knee-jerk retaliatory violence is not based upon the dignity of my enemy, even if they, even if I'm still angry at them, even if I'm not ready to reconcile with them, right? All the things are true. And if you look at the kind of Western system of justice, it is based almost entirely upon the idea that harm is what balances harm. That if you have harmed me, then the state needs to harm you in response. And it's only when you have been sufficiently harmed in response and we have decided that the amount of harm you suffered is equal to the harm you caused, that we're even and justice has been served. And so we have this, carceral state, this system of incarceration in our country where people who have caused harm are harmed immensely in return. And then once they have, quote unquote, paid their debt to society, then they're released and there's still no foundation for new life. The person who has suffered the initial wrong hasn't been repaired in any way. The person who has gotten out of prison has their future's been compromised. Like that, we haven't actually done the work that forgiveness would have us do, which is take seriously the wrongs that have been done and try to figure out what it would mean as community move forward. And instead, we've just harmed in response, and then presume that at the end of that reciprocal harm, everything will be balanced and fine. And just looking around at the way things shake out in our culture, we know that's not how it works out.
Yeah, I think what that helps bring out is the rhetoric, often can be couched anti-Semitically of the Christian view as somehow superseding, or even the use of Martin Luther King quote about "an eye for eye makes the whole world blind." That doesn't quite capture what you're trying to capture, which is it's there's something to that retaliatory framework because it registers what the harm is. It serves, like we said, with memory. It registers what exactly the harm was, which is needed,
Yeah.
and that it's even turning the other cheek has a type of similar structure, like one action, and then you're reacting in this kind of parallel way. It's not retaliation, but it carries some of that. It carries
Yeah.
some of that legacy of it's by turning my other cheek that in a certain way I've registered that you've hit the other
Yeah.
cheek, and that's a really interesting um, kind of way to um, have more continuity than is usually talked about.
Can I actually jump in there for a minute? Like there,
Oh yeah, please do.
and I think this is a legitimate interpretation from, ancient historical kind of critical analysis of the Gospels. Jesus actually is the examples he gives are registering, are meant to try to signal that the harm is being registered. So Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn them to your left. If you're facing someone who strikes you and you get struck on the right cheek, that means they've struck you with their left hand, which is the defiled hand in the ancient world. If you turn your left, that means you're inviting them to strike you with their right, which is the hand they're not supposed to strike you with, right? So you're
Yeah.
saying you are gonna, right? Or the thing about if someone gives you their ask for your cloak, give them your shirt as well or tunic as well. Um, uh, if a person takes your clothing and you give your undershirt as well, you would defile the other person if they see you naked, right? And so this idea that like I'm going to show you how you're harming me, or that if someone asks you to walk 1 mile, walk a second. At the time, Roman soldiers could conscript any person to carry their belongings for a mile, but it was illegal to do more, right? And so volunteer to do the extra mile to show to the person, registering the harm is absolutely the stake in what Jesus is doing. And the other thing is, I think it's important, again, we gloss over this, or because the teaching is so familiar, we don't even hear it, that Jesus says, love your enemy, right? What Jesus doesn't say is, your enemy's actually your friend. It's all fine. Just repair, right? Jesus, no, your enemy's still your enemy. The moral problem is not to try to convince yourself that they're your friend. It's what does loving my enemy look like, right? If the Christian ethic is about loving your neighbor as yourself, and your neighbor might be your enemy, right? Then you have this matrix of commitments that I have. I have to love myself. I have to love my neighbor, who my enemy might be harming one or both of us, and I got to love my enemy. Like that becomes a really complicated moral problem. But that is the moral problem, right? That person's still my enemy. I need to figure out how to respect their dignity as beloved children of God while also protecting myself and protecting my neighbor, right? And that's when I'm not saying that, again, that the forgiveness, this is what I mean about the messiness thing, right? Forgiveness doesn't tidy up everything and make it go away and turn my enemy into my friend. Forgiveness just names the mess. Here's what you have. You have an enemy who God loves, and you have the two of you who they threaten. How are you going to manage this? And how are you going to navigate it? Because these are the demands that the Christian tradition at least places upon you. And making it tidier or pretending that it's clean is just gonna oversimplify at best, and at worst, just put people at risk and cause more harm.
Right. So, in mentioning love of self, I did want to raise a topic that we've actually had a salon here at Interintellect by Gina Hafez on self-compassion and forgiveness, the idea of self-forgiveness as a kind of a challenging Forgiveness is challenging enough, but how do we understand this somewhat, maybe not totally internally directed, but self-directed practice of forgiveness? How does your model uh, maybe help us distinguish what, is that rationalizing it's not rationalizing my faults away, it's not rationalizing my harms away, but what is it ideally? To what
Yeah.
extent self-forgiveness, to the extent it makes sense?
Yeah.
How would you parse that?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a couple of things that, books are only done because we send them in and get them printed, right? I mean, if I could, I wish I had said more about self-forgiveness because that's a lot of what people ask me about when I talk to people about what I wrote in the book. There are a couple of other things that, that maybe we can talk about. Reparations, something I wish I had talked more about in the book. Um, I think the way I tend to think about self-forgiveness, I want to use the same model I use in the book, which is that forgiveness is a posture of loving non-retaliation. And I think sometimes that posture is almost harder to bear towards ourselves than it is towards people that harm us. You know, like if my kids harm me, my kids aren't real old, so they don't harm me real bad. It could get worse, I know. Or if my spouse harms me, like sometimes, depending on the harm, obviously, but sometimes it's easy to say, you know what, a loving posture, I'm not going to hurt you back. I know why I know what part of your past is causing you to lash out at me this way. And I don't need to, I can show some restraint and not retaliate. Um, Sometimes that's easier. I'm easier on other folks than I am on myself, right? Whereas when I do something wrong, then I want to punish myself. How could you do that? How could you, you're just, oh my gosh, you always do that. And instead of taking a posture of kind of non-retaliation towards myself, I take a punishing retaliatory posture to myself, right? Like, what would it mean to be able to do both things? Again, the hard thing for us as humans is either we try to explain away our faults and pretend they're not there, or we beat ourselves up for having them, right? The kind of the middle ground of forgiveness for others or for ourselves would be to take honest stock of who we actually are and our real failings, but then not to punish us, retaliate against ourselves for them, but to think about, okay, this is what I did. This is how I messed up. What does it mean for me to try to build a new life, taking serious stock or to make a way in the future, taking serious stock of my actual failings, right? Our temptation is to do one or the other. Our temptation is to say like, well, I didn't actually fail. It's fine. Or that's not me, or no, they did it. I didn't do it, right? Or to do the other, which is like, oh, I'm worthless and I have no future, and just to dwell in and to punish ourselves for that. The difficult kind of spiritual challenge of self-forgiveness is the same for interpersonal forgiveness, which is to say, no, this is what happened and it can't be undone. But even though it can't be undone, the past can't be undone, the future can still be made. And so, what would it mean to take serious and honest stock of that past without building a future around punishing retaliation, trying to build a future around righting wrongs in a meaningful way that leads to some kind of repair or flourishing?
Yeah, I like that, and um, it reminds me of a line I think near the end of your book, and I believe from a conversation we had a while back about your next project. I think I was looking for it, but I think I see the root of your next project.
Okay.
You
Ready.
talk about with Beloved that part of the non-retaliation is imagining a peace that is not uh, that does not involve retaliation, that there's an imaginative element to what forgiveness is, whether it means turning the other cheek, imagining this new form that is non-retaliatory and yet still registers the harm. Uh, it seems like that imaginative function is another positive part about what forgiveness is, that
Yeah.
you need to construct a future. You can't just have it be blank, I don't know what, but it needs to be, there needs to be some vision, there needs to be some new form. And I registered the one of the Greek words that you use, the verb, the noun that comes from it is harmatia.
Mm.
Harmatia is as both like in Aristotle, a tragic flaw, but in the Democritus, it's the swerve. It's the like new, unexpected motion. And that to me there was something around that of like, I think that resonates to me of that forgiveness has that imaginative and also novel characteristic.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
just my impression. I don't know
I
what
think that's
you think about that.
I think that's right. That's a less stated reason also why I want to use imaginative literature, literary fiction in the book. It's not just because literary fiction lifts up the mess and raises questions rather than rushing to answers. That's part of it, but also because they are exercises in imagination, right? And if what forgiveness is trying to to move forward into a just world and to respond to wrongdoing with love, that has to be an imaginative exercise because the world is not just and is not governed by love. So any movement into the future, which is a world of loving justice, has to be an act of imagination because it can't be a redescription of the world as it is. It has to be an imagination of the world as it will be. And so it requires us exercising a different kind of moral and intellectual muscle, which is this imaginative it's imagination, right? Because yeah, because that world doesn't exist yet, and might never. But the way from here to there has to move beyond the world as it is. It can't just be description.
Yeah. I think we have a question in the chat about Fred Gray from Trey that apropos of Martin Luther King. Just curious if you've read much of Fred Gray and about his role. And there's, I guess, a Fred Gray Institute that just started.
No, I'm not familiar with Fred Gray, but it looks like I should be. Is it the custom for folks to chime in and speak? I'd love to hear more about Fred Gray if that's the habit.
Yeah, Trey, I know you said you were on the road. If you want to unmute and want to, if you can't, understood. But if you can,
And if you can, I can also share my email, Trey, and you can.
Here,
yeah,
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see how long this works. I'm somewhere in between Houston and San Antonio in Texas right now. But no, so Fred Gray was the attorney for King, Parks, the movement, and going down the list, including later the Tuskegee syphilis case and all that. But he's still alive, I think, at 94.
Well,
And the Institute, well, that started a few months ago, but like in the last, what was it, 3 or 4 weeks ago, last month or so, they opened up, they basically had the official launch of it. And so that's why it was kind of top of mind. But he also had an interesting thing that only gets like a page or two in his book, but I've discussed this with him, is that in Tuskegee, they actually merged a white church and black church in the 60s, I think. And it may have been earlier than that. But I was just really surprised when I heard that a few years ago and just how it happened and like how are the members showing up, and just agreeing to it. And then when he discussed it, I was like, oh yeah, never had a problem. It was normal from day one. Yet if you look at the timeline and what's going on outside of that, I'm like, it was quite the opposite of normal. And so I couldn't help but when you mentioned King being one of the inspirations for your thoughts on forgiveness, thinking about that as well. So I hope that made sense.
yeah, it did. Thanks, Trey. I'm not familiar with Fred Gray, but I'll look him up. Where is the institute? Like, what is it?
It's at Tuskegee University.
At
He's still in
Tuskegee. Okay.
Tuskegee. He still
Okay.
practices law.
Wow.
Still, it's going to church at
Wow.
Tuskegee Church of Christ. I mean, it's kind of amazing when it comes
Yeah.
down to it.
For sure, I absolutely will. Thank you for the recommendation and reference.
Thank you. And I'm just ordered your book. Gets here Wednesday, so I'm
Great.
looking forward to reading
Great.
through it. So
thank
if I
you.
do contact you in the next few weeks after having read the book,
Yeah.
I may have a more specific information for you then.
Yeah, sounds great. And my email address is public, so if you go to either the Harvard Divinity School or the Harvard Memorial Church website, you can find my email address.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great example, and it brings to mind a book that I'm reading by Patrick Radden Keefe called Empire of Pain. My black background is blurred, so it doesn't. There it is. About the Sackler family and the opioid crisis, because that we've talked about self-forgiveness. Trey's example of Tuskegee connects with medical testing, things done quote unquote in the name of science that were atrocities, and the opioid crisis and what the Sackler family did over generations, and not just them, but the organization that created, the industry that they created. That to me is, I'd be interested in what you think as more of the large scale, kind of ungainly, systemic violation. How do we, to what degree do we apply something like forgiveness in that direction, knowing that it can't be the same as a single perpetrator or something like that, but where the perpetrators are more of a cloud and more of a systemic phenomenon. How do we navigate the concept of forgiveness, knowing that, for example, the media will go for a very shallow, like, hey, they thought they were going to remove people's pain, so it's time to forgive and let the Sacklers go. What's the better way, I guess, of how we might do that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a better way. I mean, I think that's a hard question. I mean, forgiveness tends to be thought through in the intellectual tradition around interpersonally, right? Corporate forgiveness, and I don't mean corporate in the level of commerce, although it could,
Yeah.
like with the Sackler family. I mean corporate, like large bodies of collections of people. How that would work is more complicated. But I think that there are ways to think through it. I mean, if you think of forgiveness as anger management, then it doesn't seem to make any sense. What does it mean for one nation to not be angry at another nation anymore, or one group of peoples, right? And that's one of the reasons why it falls apart at the level of corporate or large bodies of people. Or if it's the same thing as reconciliation, as in the South African example, like, do you get into some problems about, um, again, I think the idea of thinking about forgiveness as trying to move forward without retaliation still is useful when we think about forgiveness at a large scale, which it doesn't mean giving up on accountability. It doesn't mean, on the contrary, it might mean, if forgiveness is really about naming the past, it might be a lot of accountability, like in the literal sense, like giving accounts. That is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were. It was people telling the stories of what happened and people having to own up to what happened. And that as the ground for trying to avoid reciprocal violence. There's a Hannah Arendt, who's one of the things I think about in the book. She talks about how violence is how is reciprocal and retaliatory, almost like a chain reaction. Like it's super predictable. If you harm someone, they'll harm you back, and then you will harm them back, and it will radiate outwards because no harm can be contained. If you harm me, you don't just harm me, you also harm people who love me, and then right, and so it radiates outward. Um, and the stop to that would be to to try to figure out what would it mean to stop retaliating, to still demand justice, to still demand accountability, but not to try to find it through reciprocal or retaliatory harm. Another one of the people I look at in the book is a person who's trained professionally as like a peace negotiator, a peacemaker, peace builder, a guy named John Paul Lederach. He's also one of the founders of the academic discipline of peace studies, but he talks about, if he's very experienced into going into situations of where violent conflict has just ceased, where the leaders have just signed peace accords, and they send him in to try to keep the peace so it doesn't erupt into violence again. And he said the surest way to fail at that work is to tell people that there will be peace, right? Because if you go in and tell people, and he said the politicians who sign the documents, they all think that the process is over because you signed the documents. Oh, we have peace now, right? He's what you actually have is a lot of people who do not trust each other and whose harm they feel like has been covered over by this peace process. And a lot of the work he said is just believing people when they tell you that they don't think the peace will hold, that they don't trust the other side. He calls it the gift of pessimism. He says that unless people feel legitimately heard, they're not going to trust you to try to move forward into the future. And the only way for people to feel legitimately heard is for you to believe them when they say peace won't work, right? And so you have to kind of sink into their despair and meet them where they are, because that's the kind of that's it's only there when you can start to make the kind of human connections where people can start to imagine something other than reciprocal violence as a way out of the mess they're in. But to kind of return to the question you asked, it really does boil down to something similar. It means giving up a kind of sentimental forgiveness where peace is the end of a thing, or where the fact that we've forgiven each other means the past is not important anymore. It's actually committing to a process where we have to face how badly we have hurt each other and name that, because whatever future we're going to build has got to be built in the ruins of where we actually are. Um, and so, yeah, I still think the non-retaliation thing works at the corporate level, but it gets a lot more complicated when it's not just, me and my spouse or me and a friend, and it becomes whole nations, especially because, the capacity for violence becomes so much more. I mean, you just don't need to look at the world today, like how how deep and extensive and how damaging the violence that states can do to each other is. Um, and it just makes those problems that much harder to respond to.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes sense. It to me, it brings up another issue that I wanted to put before you as someone that works in human robot interaction and AI ethics. I I mean, already see the idea of interaction with something automated or algorithmic as being a different type of challenge, but not unrelated to kind of corporate evasion of responsibility that, hey, the chatbot did that, Meta didn't do it, Google didn't do it, Amazon didn't do it. It's just that thing we built had some kind of autonomous operation. And I so I wonder about where that type of interaction, where people might rely on these interfaces, both to reflect on what they want, reflect on what they're going through. We know that there are people that are already using um, LLMs as almost companions of friends, just to have someone to type and get a response. The interpersonal that you pointed out as being an implicit basis, uh, that to me raises this question of what happens when it's not totally novel. Bureaucracy, things like that have removed personal interaction, but how do we start thinking about these layers in between that might distance. You talk a lot in the book about acknowledging distance, acknowledging loss, and not trying to resolve it or close it. So there's no sentimental idea. I would take it that you would not want just a straight out anti-technological. We've got to just meet in person, face to face. Our very discussion here would attest to that. But yeah, I just wondered what comes to mind for you when you think about some of that phenomenon.
I'm not sure. Could you say more about how you're thinking about it? I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, part of what naming a wrongdoing is, it has to also name the wrongdoer, right? There has to be, we have to be able to identify the one who caused us. Like one wouldn't be inclined to forgive like the hurricane, right? Like there's not, if that's not the way we tend to think about what forgiveness is, because we don't think about a natural disaster as an agent, right? In the same way. Um, but I think what you're saying, and obviously you know a lot more about this than me, is that LLMs and AI, insofar as they act on behalf of corporate entities or like human entities, but are also not the same as human entities, opens up this kind of middle space. And I guess the question is like, where does one, yeah, where, that's a great question, Thomas.
I
Like,
mean,
where does one
yeah.
place culpability or responsibility, right?
Yeah, I think that the issue is that in some of these interactions, and we see it in social robots or in just online chats, some of the even the use of first person.
Yeah,
Tell me what
yeah,
for a system that we would necessarily ascribe first person to. Uh, there's certain violations that come from the interaction, but uh, aren't necessarily something that was scripted by some corporate head.
right.
It came from just looking at patterns in internet language and
Yeah,
finding certain tokens and then putting them out. But we've seen the recommendation of suicide, for instance,
yeah,
from an AI agent that recommended suicide to a person, and so there's clearly a wrongdoing. I think most would agree there's a wrongdoing, but the form of it, it's not just the bureaucratic, I'm a representative of Meta and I've come here to,
right,
you know,
right.
it's the pretense of an individual. It's a pretense of a person that just seems to add a kind of wrinkle where the undoing or the process of naming the wrongdoing is itself kind of difficult in terms of the instincts
Yeah,
that were taken. I mean, another example might be content moderation, just the horrific stuff that the people that are employed at low wages to do content moderation, the things that are being submitted that they have to watch are awful and, are often gruesome. It's not the tech company that's submitting it, but it's almost as if you should know better. You should know that this type of material is coming
yeah,
into the content moderator. So,
yeah.
yeah, it just seems to be these kind of wrinkles of how wrongdoing
Yeah.
holds.
I mean, they're fascinating and complicated wrinkles, right? I think especially like the situation where the AI recommends suicide to someone, right? That's clearly a harm, right? Uh, and a person would be would be harmed by that recommendation. But the question is like what is the who is the one who is responsible for that harm? Because it kind of moves outside the interpersonal framework by which we tend to think about moral injury. Um, I honestly, I don't really have an answer to that. But I think it's really fascinating. I got to think about it. Honestly, that's great. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you work with this technology a lot. Like, how would you think about how one should? I mean, obviously there are responses. The person deserves support, and like, there might be ways in which the the corporation or the company, while not directly responsible for the statement, could also be responsible for providing support to people who have these bad interactions with AI. But locating responsibility becomes very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just an interesting systemic issue about who where are the deficiencies in care, where are the deficiencies in acknowledgement or presence, and that in your role on campus in terms of providing spiritual care. I think this is where things are headed in terms of certainly for bad, but maybe in some threads for something more constructive and good, that people do think about how could these assistants, how could this form of technology be something that supports rather than just substitutes in a inferior way for acknowledgement. And I think we're in some ways the task is to think with you in your book and to really think, okay, what are these examples in literature and in history where people have confronted wrongdoing, and how just thick embodied historical it is, because when we do that, the technological versions will be exposed, I think, for their deficiencies in a manner that someone hyping the technology may not want to get into. I mean, I think the novels that you pick, I mean, Beloved and LaRose, the idea of giving a child, to a family when you have been responsible for their child's death is just, I hadn't read that. I've read the other 3 books that you mentioned, but not that one, by Louise Erdrich. I don't know if you had any additional comments on that, but for those who are going to read the book, it's just a fascinating novel that I can't wait to read, but also your treatment of it is just a mind-expanding way of thinking of forgiveness, for sure.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, one of the things that was writing, I find writing to be hard, and I like it and value it, but it doesn't mean I like it. I mean, I don't enjoy it, I guess. I like it and value it. I'm not sure I enjoy it. But one of the high points was just being able to sit with these novels I love for a while. So there are 4 novels. Trey just asked in the chat. There are 4 novels that I focus on in addition to the theoretical, theological, and philosophical material. I read a book called The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. That's in the first chapter. In the second chapter, I read Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. In the third chapter, I read La Rose. Yeah, there it is. La Rose by Louise Erdrich. And in the last chapter, I read Beloved by Toni Morrison. And you don't, as you know, Tom, you don't have to have read those novels before you read my book. On the other hand, if you haven't read those novels, I would have, I mean, if you only have time to read one thing, read the novels, not my book, because the novels really are beautiful, all 4 of them. And La Rose is a really interesting one. It's almost like there's lots of dramatic stuff in the book, but the heart of the book happens in the first 6 pages, and then the rest of the book is just the aftermath, which is that 2 families in Louise Erdrich tends to set her novels in and around Indian country in North Dakota and Minnesota, Ojibwe communities in the Great White North, and in this book there are these 2 families that live next to each other, kind of they're related by both of the women who are the mothers they're half sisters, and they each have a 6-year-old child in addition to other children in each family, 6-year-old sons. And in the first page, the father in one of the families is out hunting deer, and he takes a shot at a buck and somehow manages to kill his neighbor's child. And following a tradition that, is at least part of Ojibwe legend. They're not sure it actually happened, but there's stories of it happening. They follow the traditional ways, and they give their 6-year-old child to the other family to raise as their own, to replace the child that was lost. And the reason I value the book and like it is, Erdrich is she writes at the intersection of a lot of different worlds. Obviously, writing within indigenous communities, also writing with folks who are living in contemporary America and with the white world. She also is writing about indigenous religion and also writing about Roman Catholicism because a lot of the folks in this community are Catholic. And one of the things I find really fascinating about the book is it takes up in that initial kind of formulation, it echoes with some of the Christian tradition, the idea of like sacrificing a child to pay for a debt or something like this. This is the way that Christians often talk about the death of Jesus. And I think it plays upon the expectations of Western readers who hear that trope so dominantly in the way we think about how harm is repaired. And then what happens through the course of the book, I think, on my reading anyway, is that Erdrich is showing that actually that's not what's happening. Something completely different is happening. And in fact, what's happening is this different conception of justice. It's not the idea of justice as a harm which replaces or which undoes another harm. It's not the idea of justice as compensation. It's actually the idea of justice as figuring out how to live together without retaliation and taking seriously the harms that we've caused one another and trying to move into a future bearing the losses that we can't recover. And so one of the things I like about the novel that especially for Christian readers like me or Western Christian readers like me, it makes me think what I'm reading is the old justice story. And by the time I get to the end, I realize that she's been telling me a new justice story the whole time. Or if you're indigenous, a traditional justice story.
Yeah, it's and you point out in the book, in the end of the novel and the ending scenes, they're set up in a way when you describe in the abstract, you feel like it's going to be the oh, this is a great kind of unifying, uplifting ending, and
Yeah.
you realize if you're paying attention that no, the mess, as you put it, the mess is still there. That the mess continues in a different form, not the exactly the same, but it's not about being easily resolved as with Beloved with Toni Morrison, that there's the more you sit with it, the more, as you said, with respect to literature, the more that you sit with it, you realize, wait, there's more to this mess than we may be tempted to describe or summarize. Well, I think one of the ending episode that you cite in your book really spoke to me as a classics major who
Yeah.
liked reading Homer and had not. I actually had read a novel. I don't know if you know Ransom by David Malouf.
Oh, that sounds familiar. No, I don't know. I haven't read it.
Yeah. Oh, I highly recommend it because it would be. I think it plays really well with how you treat. It's all about that ending incident in the Iliad between
Really?
Priam and Achilles. That Achilles has lost Patroclus,
Yep.
his dearest friend, and Priam has lost Hector, whose body has been desecrated and um, is in. Uh, it's been dragged behind a chariot, and it just seems like this is the epitome of something that you can't repair, and yet this incident of Iliad of the Priam and Achilles having this very charged and very hard for a Christian reader not to see, wait, this is all about the loss of a son that, and a father's love for a son and how you do that. Maloof the novel is just all about that ending incident and really just beautifully described, very just vivid imagery, sensory imagery of it. So I think it really fits what you do with it. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you were thinking in choosing that because it's just a really interesting ending image, which does lead to that idea of mourning that your overall point. But
yeah. I mean, so it was a little bit of a, I mean, I didn't really know what to do with that 10 pages or whatever, or 8 pages or however long it is. It didn't really fit anywhere else in the novel. I mean, in my book. And so I put it on as an epilogue, where I hope it works. Right. But what I see there is like, I spoke to you already about how Hannah Arendt shows up in my book a bit. And there's an interesting kind of side story, which is that she wrote this theory of forgiveness, which I just talked about, which is about this idea that we can begin again, that violence can become reciprocal, almost like gravity, but the humans have this unique capacity to do something else, to choose not to do the gravity thing and respond with violence. We can choose something else. Um, and one of her biggest fans was the English American poet W.H. Auden, who's a favorite poet of mine. And after he read this account of forgiveness, he wrote her and talked about how wonderful he thought the book was. And he said, I love everything about the book except how you describe forgiveness. And Auden said, because forgiveness is an internal experience, it's an emotional thing, right? He says, what you're talking about, Hannah Arendt, what you're talking about is pardon, which is the opposite of punishment. What I'm talking about, what Christians are talking about, is forgiveness, which is charity, which is love, which is a feeling. And then he wrote this essay about how you can't portray forgiveness properly. He's talking about Shakespeare because Shakespeare has all these comedies which end with forgiveness. And he said they end with forgiveness, but we can't really see forgiveness because forgiveness is something that happens on the inside. And you can't really, in drama, you can't show what's on the inside. Like in a novel, you can describe what's happening inside someone, but you can't show it in drama. And so he wrote this whole thing, but the reason I gave all that backstory is because Auden also has this poem called The Shield of Achilles. And it's written in the wake of World War II, which is also when Hannah Arendt wrote her book. And he gives this account of Achilles getting his shield made by Hephaestus, the god of armor and everything. And Hephaestus is in legend, you're a classics major, you probably know better than me. But in legend, the shield of Achilles is supposed to be this amazing shield with all these scenes of martial glory, whatever, um, grafted into it. Um, and so Auden describes, in the wake of World War II and all its devastation and genocide and everything, he tells the story of Achilles getting his shield made. And instead of all this martial glory, the scenes on Achilles' shield are just devastation and barbed wire and all the awful things that a person like Auden, surviving two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, had seen how evil and awful war was. And one of the scenes he describes is, he says, there's this one of the scenes is where no one would weep because another wept, right? And in this poem about Achilles, I feel like that has to be a reference to this moment in the Iliad. And there's this person, Simone Weil, who's a French philosopher. When she reads the Iliad, she talks about the Iliad the way that Hannah Arendt talks about violence. She says that the Iliad is this, what she calls it, a poem of force, where violence is like gravity, where like people harm and harm and harm and harm and they can't stop harming each other. She says, except for there's this one moment of grace, which is when Priam comes to Achilles and weeps, and Achilles sees him weep. And because they both weep, they stop and they all bury their dead, including Patroclus and Hector, and they eat a meal together. And she's like, and it doesn't mean the war's over, it resumes, right? She says, but this moment of grace, this moment is the moment when humans have the possibility to do something other than reciprocate violence. We have the possibility to see the suffering of another and make a different choice. And she says, this is what forgiveness is. And I think that Auden, even though he wasn't thinking about forgiveness when he was writing the poem, I think he is also saying like that we have these moments where we can pause and tell a different story and do something else. And that's where we can exercise a different imagination. And I think that's what forgiveness is or can be.
Yeah, well, that is a great, it is a great way that your book ends. And it's also a great comment that helps bring us full circle about rethinking about forgiveness, thinking about emotion and the social and the political, uh, and really deepening what we bring to the request to forgive. So I'm looking forward. I think that your next book is about imagination. Is that right?
Well, we'll see. I think my
Okay,
next,
I won't pin you down on that one.
no,
You may need to imagine a different
yeah. I mean, the next book,
future.
I think the next book is about apocalypse.
Yeah.
But I think that, again, that's an anticipated future we need to figure our way towards. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I was steering it way toward imagination
Oh,
and
it's okay.
away from the revelation. But look forward to reading your book on apocalypse. No pressure to get it done, but yeah, just a fascinating book. Again, I highly recommend it to all of you that have attended. And uh, yeah, just I will. I know that your first book is on Cormac McCarthy, so I think Enter Intellect may have some Cormac McCarthy fans that may be in touch for a future
Great.
on.
That'd be great. I'd love it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone that attended. I think this has been like your book, full and a lot to think about and carry with us, but really gripping about real life and what forgiveness is. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thanks everyone for joining.
All right.
Okay.
Take good care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.